Inventing Reality. Section: Evil, Power-Hungry Leftists. The accomplishments of revolutionary or popular governments in advancing the well-being of their peoples remain one of the more thoroughly suppressed stories in the U.S. press. Quote, "You never read anything about the good that Allende was doing," admitted one former attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Chile. Earlier, we noted how the press squelched news about the economic advances of the Allende government, the new jewel in Grenada, and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and depicted them as oppressive regimes. The U.S. press characterizes nations going through transformations that limit the prerogatives of private capital as taking the, quote, totalitarian road. Once designated as, quote, leftists, they are assumed to be up to no good and are accused of destroying individual freedom and democracy in countries where no freedom and democracy had existed under the previous right-wing regimes. After almost a century of propaganda, designations like Marxist, communist, leftist, or leftist guerrillas create their own automatic negative framing. Thus, in regard to the invasion of Grenada in 1983, a New York Times editorial decided that the fear was, quote, real, that Grenada could infect the Caribbean region with militant leftism. But the Times offered not a word about the actual programmatic content of Grenadian, quote, militant leftism. In such instances, the media do not publicize the capitalist ideology as such. They just assume it. In actuality, the distinguishing characteristic of Marxists or leftists, as opposed to rightists, is a commitment to the kind of social and economic change that benefits the less favored mass of peasants and workers, at the expense of the wealthy classes of the Third World and Western financial interests. The revolutionary and Marxist left is committed to using a country's resources and labor for the purpose of eliminating poverty and illiteracy and serving the social needs of the populace rather than the profit needs of rich investors. From the U.S. news media, one learns that leftists and communists are not persons motivated by longings for justice, equality, and a decent life, but conspirators who, quote, take advantage of such longings. Discussing the struggles in Guatemala and El Salvador, Washington Post editor and former CIA agent Philip Gayelin referred to, quote, communist exploitation of grievances and the communist contribution to instability. We learn that leftists try to, quote, gain strength, create chaos, take advantage of turmoil, destabilize, and grab power, subverting whole countries in the doing. What moves them to such perilous undertakings? As the press would have it, Marxists and other leftist revolutionaries will risk and sacrifice their lives because of nothing more than a nihilistic pursuit of power. Supposedly, they do not seek the power to end misery and hunger. They simply hunger miserably for power. If they initiate land reform, public health programs, and literacy programs, it is only to win popular support and further secure their power base. The media usually do not explain why right-wing leaders are above using popular programs to secure their power base. Such reforms would defeat the very purpose of their existence, which is to live well off the impoverished labor of others. So they rely instead on death squads, police terror, and slash-and-burn counterinsurgency. The leftists are so wanting in virtue that even their seemingly good acts can be dismissed as venally motivated. The press does not explain why, if revolutionaries are driven only by a hunger for power, They identify themselves with the oppressed and powerless, rather than with the powerful oppressors. Why do talented and highly intelligent leftist leaders take such a dangerous and painfully circuitous road to power, when they might more advantageously apply their energies to winning the rewards of high position and influence by serving the existing system in the manner of countless political climbers in both rich and poor countries? The media treat leftist revolutionary struggles in El Salvador, Angola, Guatemala, and other countries as dangerous conspiracies, not as the outgrowth of popular grievances and mass struggle. Revolutions are seen as being, by their very nature, disruptive, destabilizing, violent, and undemocratic, even when directed against oppressive tyrants, especially the, quote, moderate authoritarian tyrants who preside over U.S. client states. However, revolution becomes a good thing, enthusiastically celebrated in the media, when it takes a rightward course, as when directed against communist governments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So a Washington Post TV critic could gush after viewing the PBS 1991 series, Soviets, quote, "Every revolution is a mystical human upheaval," end quote. All communist or other left revolutionary governments, be it Cuba, Vietnam, Libya, or Nicaragua, under the Sandinistas, have made friendly overtures to the United States. But even when reporting such positive gestures, the U.S. press perpetuates the stereotype of communists as sinister aggressors. In 1984, the New York Times ran a, quote, news analysis, headlined, quote, "What's Behind Castro's Softer Tone?" The headline itself suggested that Castro was up to something. The opening sentence read, quote, "Once again, Fidel Castro is talking as if he wants to improve relations with the United States." Quote, "as if, not actually." Castro, explained to the Times, was interested in, quote, "taking advantage of American trade, technology, and tourism, and would, quote, prefer not to be spending so much time and energy on national defense," end quote. Here seemed to be a promising basis for improved relations. Cuba's own self-interest, Castro was saying, rested on closer economic ties with Washington and cuts in Cuban defense spending, and not, as the United States was saying, on military buildups and aggressive confrontations. Nevertheless, the Times analysis made nothing of Castro's stated desire to ease tensions, and instead presented the rest of the story from the U.S. government's perspective. It noted that, quote, "most Reagan administration officials seem skeptical. The administration continues to believe that the best way to deal with a Cuban leader is with unyielding firmness. Administration officials see little advantage in wavering," end quote. The article did not explain what justified the, quote, "skeptical" stance, nor why a negative response to Castro should be described as, quote, "unyielding firmness," rather than, say, quote, "unyielding rigidity." Nor did it say why a willingness to respond seriously to his overture must be labeled, quote, "wavering." The Times left the impression that power-hungry Castro was out to get something from us, but our leaders weren't about to be taken in. There was no mention in the article of what the United States had to lose if it entered friendlier relations with Cuba. Another leftist defamed by U.S. press propaganda was Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti, a populist priest who sided with the poor against the rich, and who blamed the United States government and its corporate system for much of Haiti's economic woes. In December 1990, shortly before Aristide won an overwhelming 70% vote to become Haiti's first freely elected president, the New York Times ran an article headlined, quote, "Front-running priest a shock to Haiti." The story admitted that Aristide was popular among Haiti's poor, who composed the vast majority of the country. Who then in Haiti was, quote, shocked by Aristide's candidacy? The business community, the army, the church, and the landowners. The kind of people to whom the Times accords respectful attention. The story quotes a, quote, downtown businessman, who alarmingly describes Aristide as a, quote, cross between the Ayatollah and Fidel, end quote. During the 9 months of Aristide's tenure, the U.S. Embassy gave every appearance of maintaining friendly relations with him. On September 30th, 1991, the Haitian military, with the support of rich landowners and the business community, overthrew the president, killing 2 of his bodyguards and hundreds of his supporters. Aristide fled into exile. The United States refused to recognize the junta. Still, it is hard to imagine that the Haitian military, trained and aided by the Pentagon, would have taken such drastic action if it had not received a quiet nod from Washington. At first, the U.S. media called for the restoration of Aristide's presidency. One New York Times reporter, displaying his delusions about U.S. foreign policy, wrote that the, quote, only reason the United States pushed, quote, aggressively to restore President Aristide was that his democracy was, quote, the last link in a chain of democratic governments Washington has been trying to nurture next door for the last 20 years, end quote. President Bush, who earlier that year had used massive military violence to restore a feudal aristocracy in Kuwait, now made it clear he would not consider using force to reinstate a democratically elected president in Haiti. Bush was even reluctant to impose sanctions on Haiti, supposedly out of fear of hurting the Haitian people, a consideration that did not deter him in regard to Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, or Iraq. Once they realized that Washington was not really unhappy about the overthrow of a leftist priest, who was more loyal to the poor than to the class that Bush and their own media bosses represented, mainstream journalists began to give Aristide the usual mistreatment. A New York Times story referred to his, quote, provocative and legally questionable behavior, end quote. A Times News analysis found him to be, quote, an insular and menacing leader who alienated his allies, end quote. The Washington Post reported that, quote, independent observers and diplomats were troubled because Aristide had used, quote, explicit and implicit threats of mob violence to intimidate opponents in the wealthy business class, in the National Assembly, and in the Army, end quote. For years, the Post story continued, there had been concern about, quote, Aristide's rhetoric and his using the threat of violence to enforce his will and fomenting class warfare in his sermons, end quote. The media refer to class warfare only when the poor fight back against the class warfare that is continually waged against them by the rich. The Post had other criticisms of Aristide. When a despised leader of the Tonton, Macoute, a terrorist Duvalierist organization, was thwarted in his January attempt to keep the newly elected president from office. Aristide, quote, was only mildly critical of the mob violence that crushed the attempt, end quote. In other words, when the people mobilize as a counterforce to protect a democratic president from an unlawful and violent coup, they should be more thoroughly condemned by that same president, because they too committed violent acts in the course of the struggle. The Post, meanwhile, said nothing about the failure of the Haitian business community to condemn the military violence that overthrew Aristide and killed hundreds of his followers. A New York Times article headlined, "High General Says Misdeeds Prompted the Coup," gave generous exposure to the coup leader, Brigadier General Raul Cedras, a member of a counterinsurgency unit set up under the former Duvalier dictatorship and trained by U.S. Special Forces. Cedras claimed that Aristide's, quote, human rights abuses were what prompted the coup. It was ironic to hear such a charge from the general who repeatedly had committed brutal violations under Duvalier and had just overthrown a popularly elected president, executing many of his democratic supporters. The press seemed to forget that it was the military, not the impoverished people of Haiti, who had the guns and who were doing the killing. The U.S. media gave more critical attention to Aristide's rhetorical denunciations of the military's atrocities than to the atrocities themselves. The media gave almost no attention to Aristide's call for a minimum wage, land reform, and enforced tax collection on the affluent, the real reasons for his overthrow. Aristide denied ever inciting his people to violence, although he certainly did urge them to unify and defend democracy against violence. Surveys by non-Haitian groups indicate that human rights violations had fallen sharply during Aristide's tenure in office. Even the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a branch of the OAS, admitted it had not received one human rights complaint since Aristide came to power. By late 1991, the new Prime Minister of Haiti, picked by the army, was Jean-Jacques Honorat, a conservative and the recipient of funds from the Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. government-funded organization that supports leaders who do what Washington wants. The message was the same as in many other countries. If democracy picks a leftist leader, then democracy has to go. End section.